And come on in. Thank you. And since we're a kind of a small yet mighty group, why don't we have this be more of a conversation? And so we'll just kind of figure it out as we go. You know, I've got some slides, I've got some information to give you a little bit of background. I'm an organizational development consultant, and so I get to do this stuff for my life. My lens is usually social justice and or leadership. And so for me, it's how do I go in and be a facilitator for change on campuses, whether that is in small groups with students or larger groups with faculty or administrators. So you know, I used to be in higher ed as an administrator, and then I shifted that, and I have a degree in organizational leadership, so I think it was a good. So what, I just want to start us first out by, I'm not going to get to introductions yet, is introductions, and I think we're small enough that we can do that. And why this session? So power, privilege, dominance, all that stuff. What is of interest to you in this topic? So let's just kind of talk about it.
I'll go first. I'm Andy. I'm the director of our Center for Civic and Social Responsibility. We just changed our name from Center for Service Learning. And that has allowed us now to start thinking about being more involved in bigger issues other than just how to have faculty do service learning. So we're all about social justice and how can we be one of several offices on campus that are the concems of KU, and that's kind of how we do it. So I came because the topic sounded interesting, and then I looked up on your website and found out that you're very interesting, and I'm going to send one of my staff to the Social Justice Training Institute.
Cool. Very good. Make the connection. So Precious is an alum of the Institute.
Oh, awesome.
Yes.
We want Amanda to go.
I'm Linda, but I like your title. And, you know, I'm Shannon Chris, from the School of Architecture, and serve as the faculty fellow in civic and social responsibility. So I'm always just really thinking about architecture and its role in society, really, you know, on some level. It can become very kind of self-serving, but I think people encourage my students to think of it as a more supportive and engaged with society and citizenship issue. So it's interesting. You know, I joined faculty that kind of old school way of thinking about architecture. I think this emerging interest in sustainability, environmental, social justice is so much interesting. Cool. You want to reach out to other disciplines. One thing that I think is really empowering being part of this group, which taps into skills of other disciplines. So I'm always looking for those.
That's good. No, I like that. I appreciate that.
My name is Drew. I'm a sophomore this year.
Woo, Drew!
And I'm a finance and accounting major, so definitely a lot of people sort of like right out of the school as people that would not be interested in social justice issues. And so this like having these sort of topics, being involved in the office of multicultural affairs is my way. Being able to sort of learn about advocacy, especially because as a high school student, there's nothing about social justice. My first day of school, but I can tell you it doesn't happen in school.
I'm Precious Forrest. I work as Assistant Director in Office of Multicultural Affairs. But I love talking about social justice, and I'm happy to talk with everybody in your office about SGTI. It's a life-changing experience. So love talking about this anytime I have the opportunity. Love hearing what other people around the campus have to say as well.
So for me, when I think about, you know, this specific topic of, you know, unpacking our knapsack, not until it's probably probably like 5 or 6 years ago. I was training, maybe 6 or 7 now. I was training with my mentor, and I was doing some training with one of my mentors, and she identifies as she's a white woman, lesbian, and identifies as butch, you know, or on the butch spectrum. And she said to me, "You're so femme." Right? And I was like, pissed. And I was like, what? You know, I should have said, tell me more about that, but I didn't. I was really thrown off by that, and we got to talking, and you know, she's from Massachusetts, and I'm from California, and so one thing I think that our definition of femme was very different. You know, femme for me in California is, you know, made up, boobs showing, skirts, like all those, like, you know, hyper feminine. And for her, that wasn't it, you know. And, you know, for her, it was how I showed up. You know, I've got long hair, I dress more feminine. She calls these my femme shoes. You know, what it was that was my first starting point to think about the places that I have privilege. And it was such a gift to get that feedback in the moment. I wasn't too excited about it. But it really helped me realize, wow, I have, you know, I have some privilege in spaces that I didn't think I did. And while as a woman, like I get, you know, men dominant group, women subordinated group, but in regards to being cisgender, and showing up as a woman and not, like, I'm never questioned on whether I'm a woman or not, you know, how I feel and how I think also matches up with my genitalia, like all of those things. And I was like, okay, so that was the turning point of me, like, really searching around power, privilege, and identity for me. Because usually I stayed in my subordinated space, you know, as a person of color, growing up working class poor, you know, and some other identities that get targeted. That's where I have lots of stories. So that was the critical moment for me to be like, yeah, I got to deal with some of my privilege. So with that, just want to ask, what is privilege? So when and it could be like, you can give me a definition, or we can talk about some bullet points, or how privilege shows up. You know, and so maybe even how privilege shows up on the KU campus, or in the community. But as we think about privilege and power, really, what is it? Look at you.
I've seen so many, Precious has said it so many times, like the OMA's definition, non-parent, unasked-for, often invisible rights and benefits, and benefits and advantages. But some people experience those.
Love it. Yes. What are some other thoughts around privilege and how it shows up?
It's one of those things where you just make certain assumptions, you know, and you don't think about how you just do stuff and don't ever worry about things as you're just going along your life and realizing that there are other people who can't even walk into the store without being followed or something like that. That's never happened to me. So, in some ways you're unaware of the deal that you have.
Yeah, unaware.
Freedom to be unaware. You don't
Yeah.
have to think about those things.
Yeah.
Like I went to a presentation and I was talking about being able-bodied, and I was like, I don't even know how you get into this room if you weren't, because I was running late and couldn't find a place to sit. How do you guys even get in here if you have a disability? And they're like, oh, you walk right by the lift. And I was like, and I went back and it's a huge purple lift. There's no way I could have missed it, and I didn't see it.
I also say that sometimes it's a disadvantage to feel that you are in this place of privilege, though. So I want to be in a community that, you know, I really do want to reach out or be useful somehow, and I feel like, you know, I can't find my place in that. I feel called or privileged, right? And I feel out of sorts, so it's difficult. This is making sense that.
Yeah, can you give me an example? Or you give us, you know, is there any tangible thing for you?
I sometimes feel like I have no right to come in and, I like to get my students involved, so let's find a way in which architecture can be useful. And so you find places where people have
so I want to be an advocate.
Yes.
And how do I do it without exerting my privilege?
Yes.
Yes, totally get that. It's a balancing act.
We have students that, to their knowledge is a privilege. And, but they need to understand it is. And how to use it. They feel the same.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think that can be, so that's the challenge of, I want to support you all, and how do I do that without it being saviorish? Yeah. And how do I help? How do I help without, it being having to be like a service project?
Right.
So to say, I think that's the thing, and I think that's a good place to be. Of, how do I do this without offending you,
Right.
while supporting you, and how do we do it together? And we got to deal with the muck, right? Because muck comes out for it, So I have this unearned privilege, as you had said, and what do I do with that unearned privilege? I think that's the part that I get stuck. It's like, especially nowadays, it's for me around the trans community, and it's like, well, how and where, and here I could be of service in this way. That's how usually I do it, These are some things that I could be of service to you for. And as a cisgender, heterosexual person, you let me know what works for you. And if nothing works for you, okay. And I think that's the hard piece, right, to hear that. Like, you know what, Becky, not now. And it's like, crap, I'm so interested, right? And usually at that point, then it's, how do I then work with my community? So how do I work with my heterosexual, cisgender community, rather than it needing for me to help them? And so how do I get the folks in the privileged space to realize that, maybe we need to look at how to create inclusive spaces rather than helping the other. And I think that it is a balance of both. So I have here privilege, and the Unpacking Our Knapsack, if we look at that, that's from Macintosh, right? And Macintosh recently revised her list. I know, huh? Yeah, so I haven't seen it, but I know in the last couple of years she's done another one. So as we think about privilege, it is access to resources and social rewards and the power to shape norms and values. Unearned power conferred systematically. And I love me some Johnson of the luxury of obliviousness. So we have in our places of privilege and dominance, it's that unearned piece, and we can be oblivious to the rest of the world. One of my mentors always calls privilege, or dynamics of privilege, arrogance, ignorance, and entitlement. And so if we really look at it, arrogance, ignorance, and entitlement. So I deserve this, and I'm going to let you know I deserve it. And I don't even know that I'm letting you know that I deserve it. That to me is fascinating. That we don't even know that that's something that we're requiring of the world to give us because we're owed it in some way, shape, or form. So that obliviousness or the entitlement, arrogance, and ignorance always strikes a chord with me. I'm like, yeah. And then if we look at dominance, just a definition is the social power of one group based upon the conferral of these privileges to the group at the expense of another. Come on in. You can come in. No worries. We're good. We're having a chat.
Okay.
I'm just standing up because I didn't want my back here right now, but I will sit down again. And here you go. I saw you earlier, like, should I go in? Yeah, come and sit over here. Do you know? Okay, fabulous. We got a new person to the group. What's your name?
Jessica.
Jessica. Hi. Wonderful. And so privilege, so dominance, it's that social power piece. And so if we look into social justice literature, you know, we will see more the language of dominance or agent. So I don't know if you architecture folks see that more in your stuff, but we in higher ed like to use those fancy terms. And then dominant systems. They have 3 characteristics according to Johnson. And if you haven't read Johnson's Power, Privilege, and Difference, read it. It is a fabulous book. It is short, and what I like about it is it's not too petty. So it's not like the academic stuff that we're used to. It kind of does it in very, like, to the point points. Yeah. So Johnson has that Power, Privilege, and Difference. It's an easy read, and it helps, at least it helps me and most other people be like, oh, okay, I got a grip around this, or I need to think about that. So systems. So, you know, if we think about large systems, they're dominated by privileged groups. They're identified with privileged groups, and they're centered on privileged groups. Even if we look at how most, not all, institutions of higher ed have been developed. You know, I mean, it's, you know, straight white men that develop these organizations. And I think even in institutions that are HBCUs, or I do some work at a few women's colleges. Even though it's a women's college, there is such dominance around male sexism of how they do their work. So even though it's mostly women, I mean, they hire men, and now we have the trans community, and they may partner with another school in which men can take classes there, but the percentage of men still on campus is so small, but it is run almost like any other organization that has been developed by white men. Fascinated me. Yeah. You know, it's like these dynamics are still taking place, and it's women. And so I think even though the dominant system for that specific institution may not have been developed by men, just the influence of education and how it's done has been influenced in the institution of how it works itself out. Yeah, it was actually really disheartening when I saw it. I was like, oh gosh, I thought it would be done a little different. And there are some things that are done differently, like they teach a lot in circles, and so, and it's a small private college, you know, so it's not lecture style, it's, you know, community circles in regards to how we teach and, you know, how they do grades. So some of that is very different and differently liberating, but there are lots of structures that you're like, what? And you would think that would be different.
Give me a couple examples of the ones that you know, just the hierarchy.
So the hierarchy definitely is existent there. I think the way that trying to create change, still that kind of same system is set up. You know, red tape-ish, bureaucracy, non-collective, going up the chain. Yes. And so those are some big pieces. Some little pieces is they still use language like guys. Hey, you guys, come in here.
Play the game.
Yeah.
Soccer.
Right, and you would think that, I mean, you're at an all-women's institution, and you still hear administrators saying, hey guys, it's time to, you know, break. Really? So just the influence, and it may be small, right? You know, a language piece, but you still hear that, and it's like, wait a second, there are no guys in here. And why are we using that language? So it could be big, or it could, for me, language is big too, but it could be a small word. Yeah.
Can I claim that I'm from Chicago and we just use guys for everything?
Right. Yeah, I know, huh?
Because hey guys is so part of my upbringing, it would really be hard for me to subtract that out.
Right.
We're gonna have one male out of 11 women. So if I said, hey gals, that might.
Right.
More guys is a more general term than gals.
Right. And what's the reason that's a more general term?
It's always guys.
And what group is the dominant group? Right. Right. It has changed. And I've still worked at schools that are 95% change that much. Right, so I used to use guys a lot also, and I got called on it a few times, and so I'm always very conscious to say everyone, or you all, or something that it can be inclusive. And then when I say, so say it, we're all men, visibly, now that we have trans folks, and so there's the gender spectrum, you know, what's my assumption that everybody's a man? And how is that inclusive language? Yeah, I've been called in the last couple of years, particularly around trans language, of being inclusive, and damned if I don't, I mean, it's hard. It is hard, you know. I think especially, you know, I always say woman of color, right? Because I can't divide those two, and because it resonates to me and family and other women of color, like women of color, right? I gotcha. And even in that space, it's such a gendered term, you know. And so for me, social justice is around how do we not take it the but, and how do we put the and there. So how do we see the multiple use? Like, okay, means a lot to me, and I'm not being inclusive. So what does that mean? How do I change that, or how do I explain that, or how do I talk about that? And it takes time and patience and intentionality, and it's messy. And how do we talk about the mess? And the mess is hard to talk about. And why do we need to? So I love this quote, a failure to integrate concerns of power, privilege, and oppression into content and dialogue undermines the effectiveness of inclusion efforts and serves to reinforce oppressive systems. I think I'll tell you a little bit about kind of the evolution of how we got into this conversation around social justice in higher ed. We started out in a diversity conversation. So, you know, back in the civil rights movement, higher ed at that time, the diversity, well, so if I go back even a little further, diversity actually meant compliance training. So if any organization had 500 or more members that were paid by the government, they had to do compliance training. And that is kind of how diversity stemmed. Yeah. So then if we look into higher ed, we started having diversity conversations, and what that really meant was, how do we get more African American students on campus? So upper administrators and faculty and folks were having these conversations. Didn't talk as much at the beginning about how do we retain these students, but how do we get these students here? So then, you know, an influx of African American students started coming on campuses, weren't retained as much, and then started needing to realize we need support services. And so that's then when you saw Black student centers, Black student unions on campus. And then we shifted into a multicultural, intercultural conversation. And what that meant was folks of other races, so Latinos, Asians, and natives, weren't talking mixed folks or Arab American. They said, well, what about us? So it was more of a grassroots effort. Administrators and faculty weren't really thinking about other races, but these folks of other races were like, hey. And so the same went for women, and the same went for people who identified as lesbian or gay. Weren't even talking bisexual, transgender, queer, any of that. And so then you started seeing either intercultural, multicultural centers develop, or you saw like other race advocacy offices, or women's centers. They weren't called gender centers, women's centers. If the LG community had any type of support, it would be within the women's center. Right? And then we've shifted to now this conversation around social justice. And what it is that definition. I mean, it's not that definition, but it's really talking about like systemic stuff. It's not talking about numbers, and it's not talking about how these numbers are interacting with each other. It's talking about how do we change systems so that we may not one day need a multicultural so how are we shifting the dynamics? And not shifting it like this, right? Because that's just one power differential over the other power. But really, how is it at an equal space? What I have found with most institutions, not all, is one, there is no, they don't even have a definition of what social justice is, right? Or what inclusion is. So when I ask them, okay, so what's social justice for you? How do you define it? Like they look at each other, they look at the ground, and they're like, well, we don't really have one. And I was like, well, that's kind of your first problem, right? You're thinking about, going out and recruiting staff or faculty or students and retaining them or creating a budget, but yet you have no foundation for why you're doing that. And then the other piece is they're still usually having the diversity conversation, right? So institutions are still having a conversation around numbers, and no judgment in that. And I'll let them know you're just having a diversity conversation. You're not having a conversation on how to shift it so that you're talking about, not so that you're shifting the surge to reinforce oppressive systems. And I think that that's then where it gets sticky for folks, because then you got to start talking about your power privilege, right? And so it's this very interconnected cycle. Hello.
Hey, I'm just dropping these off.
Okay, just drop it off, and you're like, I can't be here. All right. So, we have this, my colleague and I do this particular session at lots of conferences with lots of people across the country. So he loves this little cartoon. So it starts off this, this is good, this is for your own good, and so there's somebody who's a slave and the white person on top of them, and then, he's saying, get off me. He's just kind of climbing, enough's enough, I'm getting up. And then, there's, I'm really sorry about being racist before. I know better now, right, after he's been stepping on him. And then he's asking, would you give me a hand? Of course not. That would be reverse racism. Look, if I got up here myself, why can't you? And it's really that notion of, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, or, how are we getting to the top, but yet stepping over. I like to call it collusion. And so when we're in places of collusion, which means, actions, behaviors, feelings, thoughts, so it doesn't have to be out of us, it can be within us, that keep the status quo in place. So it may be that, I do great social justice work, but I have some heterosexist ideas and ideology. And what am I doing then to deconstruct that internally? And I still catch myself when somebody, says partner or, who they're married to, I always think of the opposite gender. Right? That's just embedded in me. And so how do I stop that internal dialogue, that narrative, that dominant narrative? We call it dominant narrative. How do I shift that? So that I just be like, oh, so, okay. Rather than thinking, all right, well, it's going to be a man if I talk to a woman, or it's going to be a woman if I talk to a man. And so those are little things of collusion that still keep us very much entrenched. But I like this. Craig likes it too, so I always put it there. Any reactions on when we think about privilege in this cartoon? Of how things kind of work in your life or what you see on campus? Working with students or staff or faculty? Anything will pop out for you?
Just that visual. Everything we've been talking about. Get on top of no understanding of once we can get to that point. It's really good. Good in there.
Any other reactions?
I think if I'm a student who pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that if I got to prove on myself, I'm saying the same thing. But I find that common in a lot of students. It's hard for them to wrap their heads around the privilege piece of it. But I did it by myself, and not really going, no, you do it. But they think everybody has that opportunity. It's America, so everybody has the opportunity to explore and just pull themselves up by the bootstraps.
how sometimes it's not a physical ball and chain anymore, right? For me, as you said that, I thought, yeah, it's not a physical ball and
But I
chain.
mean ball and chain in here.
No, but I loved how you said that, but that, for me, that was like, yeah, I think we still have ball and chains, even though may not be physical ball and chains anymore. Yeah. Okay. So then we have us, and these are just a few of them. Most of these are the ones I like that are more the heavy hitters, the ones that you see more research being done around. The more that you hear people talking about, you'll see more classes around these. So I just have here, as we think about social group identities, so the groups that we belong to, social, economic class, religion, spirituality, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, gender, identity and expression, size and appearance, educational background, and then others, because there are many, many others as we think about identity that fall into there, whether it is athleticism, whether it is nationality, citizenship, especially in the country, immigration reform. It could be sexual assault survivorship. Yeah, so there are many, many others. So, that's just not it. But these are the ones that I think most institutions pay attention to or talk about. And when I really look at this and I think of privilege, I think the ones that are most talked about right now, and probably for the last few years, sexual orientation has been the big one on campus. And then gender identity and expression is starting to pop its head up more. If we look at admission applications, we're trying to do more gender-neutral bathrooms, housing on residence life and housing are trying to figure out how do they house folks that identify as trans, and so those applications are becoming a little bit different. If we look at even women's institutions, that's a fascinating conversation around who's admitted, and so do you have to be born biologically female and be F to M, but in transition, and can you get accepted? Or if you're M to F and you're in transition, at what point are you in transition that they say that you're acceptable to be admitted? So I think that that's another one that's up for us more often. I would say the ones that I rarely see anything around are ability. Let's see here, age, socioeconomic status and class. I think that one's not talked about on institutions because we're supposed to be the level playing field. So like if you get your education, you're supposed to be launched into this other life. And so it's supposed to be the equalizer. And so that's why we don't talk about it. And I think as a society, we don't talk about class. And I mean class beyond money. That also contains social capital and cultural capital. And so while I am middle class, probably lower middle class in my profession, I'm seen very differently as Dr. Martinez. And I'm heard differently, and I can work a system so much differently than my parents. So when they're having issues with insurance companies, I pop on in, have the conversation, and they treat me so differently. And so it's just not money, it's the understanding of how to deal with systematic dynamics. And we don't talk about that, particularly in higher ed too, right? Because then we got to deal with systematic dynamics, and they don't want to do that, at least not most of them. And then I think, race and ethnicity, people get tired of talking about. And so I think it's one of the more salient ones that are in our country. And it's like, well, we've done that already, right? Or we're post-racial because of the president. Or race is made up. Yes, it's a social construction, and it very much impacts the reality of many of us, of all of us. But if you're white, and if we talk about privilege and entitlement, ignorance, and arrogance, then we don't have to pay attention to that. So that's kind of the background for that. what I want you to do, and so then here are lots of others, right? Even thinking style, whether you're a parent or a single parent or a partner, family status. So lots of other ones. What I want us to do, though, we're not going to do the playing card because there's not enough folks, and that's okay, is I want you to go to this sheet. And as we think about our groups, so it's the dominant subordinated groups, I just want you to go through and circle. Circle which groups you belong to. So in the middle are the groups, and then to the left side is the dominant group. To the right side is the subordinated group. Does everybody have pens? Because if not, I have pens. Okay. Here. Okay. You're good? You're good? Okay. And so I want you to circle, and so like circle the side, don't circle the middle, but circle the group that you actually belong to. And then there's a few spaces, and you can make many more spaces of ones that may not be listed. Also, there may be some where you'll circle both sides, and that's okay. Like, I get that. There's some that are not, but there's some that may have some fluidity to it. And then tally up each column. So how many DOMs you have, how many subs you have. I like your face. You're like, all right, let's talk about this. Yeah. So any reactions or thoughts from this?
Yeah. Never did know this. Like, this is really remarkable. And I also feel like it's private information. It's just like, are we allowed to talk about these things? Like, that's some of it.
Yeah. Welcome to my world.
Yeah.
We can talk about it. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I know. But
Right.
society didn't allow us.
Right. Yeah. So specifically, I think within your all's work is how do we start having those conversations that we're not used to? Those crucial conversations around identity and who we are and how does that play into what we do and who comes in, our area and office and not. And yeah. What are other thoughts, like, in regards to this sheet? Reactions.
I think there's a couple times in the activity of students, this is the first time where I've ever felt like this is not right. Like, I've got a lot more dominance than I normally do, which maybe because it's the added categories or the way my sheet is lined up, and I'm going to service. And I'm like, what? No, that's not me. So I'm, for the first time, actually feeling some sort of that guilt or denial that comes with privilege for the person.
Really?
Yeah.
And wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So you having any anxiety then, or what do you?
Not, but I think sometimes I wear my subordinate identities as like a badge of honor or pride. And I like to say I'm not the person who runs to those identities, but now I'm looking at this like, yes, I do, because I'm feeling like, the self-side isn't me. I don't feel like that's who I am, but I feel that.
So you got a lot more on the left side than you had thought. What about you over there?
I have a lot on my,
On your right side?
yeah,
A lot.
yeah. I find it, I mean, I don't feel bad or like guilty or like anything. I mean, I just find it that that's me, you know. And I grew up, you know, in our really urban city, KZK, Wyandotte County. So growing up, I grew up with like this sort of stereotypes. And, you know, at first it was really hard because I moved when I was 7 from Mexico. And, you know, you would feel completely lost because you really wouldn't know, you know, you didn't know nothing, no English. It was just difficult. But like as growing up and growing and advancing and, you know, doing good stuff, you know, getting out of what they considered, you know, bitchhood or whatever, you just felt, I mean, I would never sit there and lie to someone, oh, I'm, you know, this is perfect. Because I know what I am and I know where I come from. I feel good.
Any other reactions?
Conflicted, my numbers are so close.
We're so close.
Yeah. I have strong on one side and strong on the other. So it's, and I was just thinking about that, being lesbian, people will always try to put you in that category. And so it's like, when you do this, you do that in relation to that group, and they'll be like, well, that's not how I identify. Because it's not, I always say, when you describe your friends, as here's my friend, Janny, and I want to know why she's heterosexual. You know, it's not the first thing you say about someone. So it's just kind of interesting to see that there's sort of balance between sides.
Conflicted, that felt.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, as I hear folks, you know, there's a push-pull. And there are days where I'm with you, Precious, like, shit. You know, I think the first time I did that, I had that realization, like, whoa, I have more dominant groups than I thought. Because many times we're in our subordinated space, and not saying, you know, that is, we're being a martyr in those spaces. And more stories, like I pay attention more in my subordinated, right? Because I need to be safe, right? I mean, let me tell you, I travel so much, I'm like, okay, well, I know that I am going to go to this airport. So I'm always, you know, I always track how many people of color are on this flight, right? You know, or how many people of color are going to be in the airport. Like, those are things that I'm always very used to. You know, if I go into a meeting where I know it's going to be faculty, I always think, how many are going to be men? And so, you know, our upper administrators, most of them are going to be men. So I need to always, because I feel like I need to have some armor, or I need to be on my game, right, in my subordinated identities. I never think about how to get on an airplane. because I don't have to pay any attention to that. So I think we spend a lot of time in our subordinated spaces because that's where we're pained, that's where we're triggered, that's where we have stories, that's where I think we have some really tight-knit communities. We don't necessarily think about that in our dominant spaces because, as folks have said, we don't have to pay attention to that, right? But I would say most of my friends are pretty able-bodied, right? Most of them have 2 or more degrees, right? If I go to my family, so my friend circle is most of them have degrees, and we use this language, and then I code switch because I've got to go home, and most of them have no degrees. Right, and so it's this balance of, like, which world am I in at this time? And appreciated the comment around, I don't necessarily introduce my friends, hey, here's my heterosexual friend that, is, has, is ADHD and, and is a Muslim. Like, you don't do that. And so what often happens in these conversations is we stay at the individual place, right? And so we are individuals. In fact, I'll bring up this slide, even though it's not the next one. Okay, so if we think of this breadth of awareness, we stay at the individual place, right? When we're in circles. The thing is, let's be clear, when we meet each other based on groups. And so while we may not name it, because if I think about dominance, I don't have to introduce, is it Susan? Shannon. I don't have to introduce Shannon as heterosexual because the assumption is Shannon is heterosexual. And so, we meet each other at these groups whether we name it or not. And I probably need to do some more work around folks with visible disabilities because I'm curious to know how they meet folks at groups. But I think for folks that are visibly able, like you see somebody, you make the assumption that they're man or woman, or black or Latino, or are using a wheelchair or not, have something on their foot or not. So when we meet people, we already have them associated with groups. And not until we get to know them as individuals do we know who they are. And so I can have all kinds of stuff around white men. And if I don't check myself on that, I'm not going to be able to sit in this space and treat you with any humanity. If I go to that space of, right? And even when you came in here, I was like, yeah, white man. Right, talking about some privilege. And so, I even put you into that group. And so I think we've got to be real with the fact that, we meet each other at the group level, even if we don't name it. And how much of that, and I don't want to get into the right, is that bad, is that good, is that right or is that wrong? What I do want us to think about is, what do we do with it? And so, as I look at this full spectrum, is that we are all individuals. Totally get that. We also are individuals that belong to groups. So individuals, if you think about the cycle of socialization or the cycle of oppression, at the individual level, we can have prejudice with each other. And we can have, so that's where we can have prejudice even within our own group. And then the group piece is then where you get into spaces of discrimination. So I have this prejudice or bias about your group, and my group has power over your group, and so we can discriminate. And so at the discrimination piece, you have to be thinking about group level, and it's not within the same group. Right? So at this individual piece, that's where you see folks of color and horizontal hostility all the time. Within the LGBT community, horizontal hostility. Like B's, just figure yourself out, right? Trans, why are you even in our group? right? You're messing up the stuff that we've already worked on. Right? So that's the horizontal hostility that's created. And then you get to the group piece, so those are two separate groups then, right? And so you could have heterosexuals and LGBTQ. And don't even give me about P and the T and the LGBT community, because we don't want to get out of our binary of gender. You know, but that's where you have white folks, you know, and folks of color. And then we have system stuff, and that's really where this oppression happens. And when we think about power, privilege, difference, oppression, we gotta always remember, I call it IGO, so individual, group, organization. Always have IGO in mind when you're looking at policies, when you're thinking about programs, when you're thinking about classes. I mean, so much stuff that's going on. You know, your faculty members, IGO is happening all the time. The thing that's a struggle is most people are just well-intentioned, right? So they're just staying at the individual level. You know, so even if we're thinking about power and privilege, they're still staying at the individual level. They're not thinking about, okay, well, these are the groups that I belong to, and this is the system that's in place. And so how are we shifting the system? And the system is a big monster, right? And so how do we take it on, right? And I think the piece to think about is, okay, so what can we take on within the big monster? Because we can't go at it all the same, like, we can't go at all of it at the same time. You know, so but what are pieces that we can look at? So, what are pieces that we can look at in regards to, you know, hiring more of X, Y, and Z staff or faculty? You know, how do we go and recruit students that are X, Y, and Z? As opposed to how do we do recruitment and budget and, you know, program and policy assess, like all of that. If we try to do all of that once, it's probably not going to work. So what are some pieces that you can take from it? Okay. Any ads or anything to say around IGO? And if it's new for you, I get it. If it's not, it's okay. If you have any ads, please don't. So let's go back to this. So if we think about dominant subordinated groups, what are some characteristics of people in dominant groups? Are the groups, not people. The people are the one that put it into action. But if we think about dominant group membership, what are some characteristics of dominant groups? Not like the groups itself, but you know, the dynamics that exist within dominant groups, or how the dominant group react.
I just assume the way I am is the way you are.
So that's the norm. Yep. So the assumption of the norm. What else?
They don't really know how to make a change, or even if they do, now that there's some sort of justice that is not getting approach the situation or make decisions about this.
So not knowing how to. Okay.
Defensiveness, power over them, or about losing it.
So it can be defensive. Yep. Anything else we can think of? So what are, hold on, I won't go to that. No, I'll just bring it up, and it's actually on, don't go to it yet, because I'm gonna ask you, well, actually, let's talk about subordinated. What are some characteristics, behaviors, and thoughts that describe subordinated groups?
Anger, fear, mercy, frustration.
Yep.
Have power.
Defensive.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to think of that dominant group where want to be in that dominant group, maybe it is.
Yeah, so trying to get to the dominant group. Okay. Fear of,
Not knowing how to. I don't know, fear of compromise, I don't know.
yeah, compromised. Talk about more why you use that word, what that word's about.
Inadequate. Well, not power, no power.
Yeah, kind of less than.
Less than, yeah,
Mhm.
inadequate. Which is fearful.
I like you were saying it's something that you're accustomed to. So whatever makes you secure, splitting your energy to reach custody.
Mhm. Yeah, sometimes like hyper aware, right? And you're constantly aware of it. Any other characteristics for either one of them? So, here are some that are also on your sheet. It's on the next page. Are often the rule makers are granted access and power, define what is the truth, what is normal, assumed to be the leader, smart. They're often afforded multiple choices, so there's all this opportunity and they can choose. They are unaware of their membership and their privilege, and they're usually less aware of exclusionary treatment. So they don't even realize how they are excluding folks in the subordinated group. They're more comfortable with folks that have what I call having assimilated. So they're comfortable with folks that have assimilated to the dominant group. They hold on to those beliefs often without examining them, so the ignorance piece. They collude to maintain the status quo, and if they challenge it, they risk being ostracized. So they stay in a place of collusion. So they may know what's going on, but if they speak up against it, maybe they're not going to be invited to the committee meeting anymore, right? Or to the social gatherings anymore. They're not going to be part of the good old boys network anymore. So it's like, do I speak up? Because if I do, that's great, and that means that I may not be part of it anymore. And often seen as individuals, and so if something happens, if they mess up, or if they do well, it is just them. So talk about that IGO piece, right? They're only seen as individuals. If we go to, and they also focus on how far we've come, right? So how far we've come in regards to race rights, how far we've come in regards to the ADA law. Well, we have some states that, have marriage for, lesbian and gay folks. So at least it's something, right? So that's sometimes the language that you will hear folks use. Within the subordinated group, it is less access to power, oftentimes seen as deficient or inferior, less than. They assimilate, collude, abide by the rules to fit in. And with that, sometimes a piece of their soul is taken. It's just like, okay, I've got to give up this part of me in order to fit in. And really, what does that mean? Their truth and experiences are often questioned or invalidated. So we have what we call social justice PLEs, perfectly logical explanations. And so oftentimes their experiences are PLE'd away. Right? Like, well, that's probably not what they meant. Or, well, I have a friend who's gay and that doesn't happen to him. And so they will be PLE'd away. They know more about members of the dominant group than dominant group members know about them. Right? So they know the rule book because they have to abide by it. And where the dominant group members don't even pay attention to the rule book because it is something that is accessible for them and they may have developed. They struggle with finding a balance of who they are and who they're told to be acceptable. They struggle finding their voice and speaking up to challenge. And oftentimes they're punished if they challenge. So kind of the same dynamic happens with the dominant subordinated groups. If, if they get out of a place of collusion, it's what's going to be the reprimand for them. And they often are seen with their group membership first, and they may be seen as individuals second, maybe. The verdict is out on that one. And they oftentimes will have language of how far we still need to go. So we still have so many states for marriage. We still have to do some work with ADA law. Don't get me started on ADA law. Okay, so women, like I still want that 21 cents in regards to every dollar that a man earns. And so it's like, okay, we still have some space and room to work on. I want you to also remember that when we think about group dynamics, okay, it's not necessarily always about numbers. And that's where you'll hear, and I try to get away from the language and coach people around not using majority and minority language, because that doesn't fit the bill anymore. And so if we even look at the wealth of this country, it ain't about numbers, because a teeny tiny percentage own 90% of the country. And so it's not a majority minority. We're having all these conversations in California because the Latino community will be larger than the white community in California, so there's all of this like energy, right? Like, ooh, the whites are going to be the minority now. It's like, okay, the whites will be in less number, but that doesn't mean that whiteness isn't going to still permeate in everything that happens in California. Right? So getting away from that numbers, minority, majority concept. They're visible and invisible group identities. And I would say for the most part, most of our identities are invisible. Especially now as we're seeing the spectrum, around gender identity expression, as a racially mixed person, so that, I throw people off all the time, depending upon what I look like, and if they know my last name or if they don't know my last name. So again, visible, not visible. And knowing that we also have group memberships. All of these are happening at the same time. And so as I hear your conflicted space, right? It's like, at what point am I asserting dominance? At what point am I, in this internalized oppressed space? And what's working when? I think that is the challenge of it, because we didn't walk in here as 23 different people. So we have these multiple group memberships that are working all of the time. It's not always about our individual style, behavior, or feelings about ourselves. So many people will stay at that individual space. I'm well-intentioned, I'm a strong, confident person, I'm competent, all of those things. Well, that's not necessarily what we're talking about when it comes to dom-sub dynamics, because we can have the smartest, competent person here, but if they are using a wheelchair, let me tell you, their group, people have already identified their group to be less than. So remembering that it's not about who we are, just individually. Again, innate, chosen, and societally defined group identities. As we look at many of these, there's that, they've been socially constructed. And the reality is that it still happens. And that last one is, you didn't ask for it and you can't give it back. And so we didn't ask to be in this place of dom-sub, cycle of oppression, but what am I going to then do with my dominant identities? I think one of the things to talk about, so has anybody here ever been triggered, your hot button has been pushed? Like somebody says something and you're like, what the, right? So you're like, yeah, that has happened. Many times, what happens if we think about social group identity is we are triggered in our subordinated space, but we act out of our dominance. So, if I get treated less than by somebody, maybe as a woman or as a person of color, Dr. Martinez comes out pretty well. Right? Like, I will cut you down with my words and make you, sound like an idiot. And so I am triggered, as a woman. But I then react out of my dominance, right? And so I think, be aware of those spaces of how when we're triggered, especially out of our subordinated space, how then do we come across? And I think that there's that internalized dominance piece that takes over. Oh, and it's an ugly beast that I don't like to have its head come out very often. Because then what happens is and then afterwards you're like, man, I was a little asshole to that person, right? And that's not the person that I want to be. And so think about that. So oftentimes when we're triggered in our subordinated space, we react out of our dominant space. People kind of do that same thing, like, yeah, you're right.
We'll push there though. Sometimes just reacting are I mean, I email in a male-dominated profession. When you're out in the field and you're telling a contractor, typically a man, that you've got to change, you got to tear that wall down and rebuild it. It puts you in this really awkward space. And I don't know. You somehow have to get their attention. Otherwise, roll over. It's really interesting.
Right.
But yeah. That's my subordinate group probably.
You're
I
like,
just turned 51.
dang. You're like, I need some more subgroups here.
I can relate.
Right.
But I understand why those pieces come out because you doubt if you play the game.
Right. And so for me, it's how do I play the game with integrity, right? And stay in congruence with my values, compassion and humanity. And what is it about me that I need them to hear me, right? And so, even if we did this thing around unmet needs. And so there's all this stuff around triggering cycles and stuff like that. But, what is not being met in that moment? And if I know that if I'm like grounded and balanced and healthy, I will react very differently, even if I'm triggered, right? I usually can manage the trigger and interact in a humane way. But if I'm not those things, I'm going to become an asshole. Excuse my language. But that's how I define myself when I become like that. And so, what are ways to do that? And what's the balance? Like how do I have to play the game and still be aligned with who I am?
It's interesting when you were talking about that and identifying a trigger, and it seemed like a trigger. When I went to was I'm a graphic designer, and so now as an administrator, getting respect is the art too. And that's my biggest trigger. That's a group I would say is my biggest subordinate group, because I'm up there with all the administrators in Strong Hall who are PhDs in things related, in higher ed or public administration. And so I'm definitely going to that place in terms of I have just as valid in education as you do, and my discipline fits into the world the same way yours does. But in dealing with those triggers, I'm now trying to subtly realize, Sherry can attest to, spread design thinking throughout the entire Strong Hall. And that's my sort of way of getting back, is making people really aware of that fact. But that, I didn't realize that, but that's really the group where I feel the most subordinate is as a graphic designer. And that's where some of my biggest triggers are in higher ed. So, wow, it's like an aha moment.
That's a great aha moment.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, I'm glad you came then.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Interesting.
And we're over a STEM with the only two.
Yes.
when you said graphic artist, I was like, all right, that's not something that I even know it, you know, I'm like, oh, you know, and so, but I, you know, think about, you know, depending upon what group you're in, you know, is, you know, where do I, so it can be that same identity, but where are places then that I feel, you know, I have internalized stuff around subordination or internalized stuff around dominance. Yeah, and then how do I then interact and all of that. So my hope is that you can let go of some of that energy now of not feeling as,
Although I do like channeling that energy into making everyone aware design, which is so without being massive about it. So.
see, there we go.
Because I have done that.
I know, it's not pretty, is it? No.
Yeah. Oh, no.
Wonderful, great. Thank you for sharing that. And I think to close out some pieces, just to point out, is that you know, our work is to engage our privileges and our dominance. So, you know, so not just be in our subordinated space, and to see it as unacceptable. I think that in these things are easy for me to put in bullet points. It is the actualization that is really difficult. So refuse to participate in systems that offer us unearned benefits, right? And I would say, you know, if we can't refuse to participate, well, at least we can challenge these systems that we get unearned benefits around. You know, and so how are we speaking out around, you know, so how are we heterosexual folks, because I just found this out around KU's partner, is it their partner program? There's none. Right, so there's no partner benefits. And so how do we, who identify as heterosexuals, refuse to benefit in that system? You know, so how are we challenging it, how are we questioning it, and how are we continuing to do that? Because when I heard that, I was like, and again, California has lots of issues, but that's not one of them. And I was like, what? Kansas doesn't have any partner benefits? That's crazy. And so what are we doing to combat that, to talk about that? To even, you know, how are we educating other heterosexuals to say, do you know that there's no partner benefits? Because I can guarantee you the LGBT community knows that that exists or doesn't exist. But I don't ever have to pay attention to that. Avoid defaulting to our subordinated identities to avoid the privilege in our dominant identities. So we've got privilege. You know, we've got educational privilege at the minimum. You know, since we are all students and or have been students. Many times people will be like, yeah, so, you know, say white women, you know, will say, well, yeah, but I'm a woman. Yes, you are, right? And let's talk about that. But you're also white, right? And so white gives you a lot of privilege. And so many times we'll deflect our privilege space and go directly to our subordinated to do the yeah but, right? The PLEs. And so hold both. I think that is the piece. Is how do we hold both? Why don't we usually do this? Is we don't know it exists. Right? Power and privilege. We don't want to give it up. It serves us really well. We think about it solely on that individual level. We actually want our privilege and our dominance. We have prejudice and we hold prejudice, and we're afraid. So we're afraid of, well, what would it look like then? You know, or if there are partner benefits, does that mean I have to pay a little more? So, you know, we're afraid of some of those things. And so these are some community foundations that my dear mentor has developed. He's been doing this for a lot longer than I have. But I think the pieces that are really important as we think about privilege are oppression is pervasive and impacts us all. There is no hierarchy, right? It may manifest itself different, but I really try to avoid playing the oppression Olympics, right? So, you know, be careful and conscious of that. about that in our privileged spaces is how are we seeking to understand folks rather than having people hear us and this is what we want them to know. We are all doing the best we can, at least most of the time, with what we have, with what we know, with who we are. There are no quick fixes. So if we think about, these foundations, there are no quick fixes. It took us a long time to get to where we are. It's going to take us a long time to get out of it. An individual in communities do grow and change. There is hope. The one that is always the most important to me, though, is communities are built through building relationships. And I think that is one of the things that's really difficult for us. And so as you said, some of this is personal. Right? We don't talk about this. And how are we building authentic relationships if we're thinking about social justice and we're not talking about these things? And how do I build relationships to talk with people that are like me and people that are not like me? So party thought is the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive systems which we seek to escape, the peace of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. I really like that, and Audre Lorde always got some good words to say. Yeah, and then the last piece is this. So who sees the duck? Who sees the rabbits? Who sees both? Who sees none of the above? Like some people will be like me, if I have a group of 100, there'll be like 3 or 4 out there. For me, this gets us out of the binary way of thinking. And so how do we not think in this binary good, bad, yes, no, and how do we put the and in there? So how do I hold that I'm a woman of color and that can be exclusive language? And then how do I engage in that conversation with others? And so maybe I will change my language. I don't know. At least right now I haven't. But when I get out of the binary, I have to do one or the other because that doesn't allow me to engage in both, the both and. So really, when we're thinking about privilege and power, let's do it in both and contexts, not one or the other. And that's it. Any questions or comments?
Just thinking, the one slide that had privilege as meant unacceptable, and growing up it was, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will earn this privilege. And privilege is a good thing, but it's so hard to recognize that it can be a bad thing. And I'm wondering, in terms of language, I almost wish there was another word instead of privilege, so that we could associate it with something negative. But then on the other hand, I'm also kind of like to comment about you're very uncomfortable with that dichotomy and the belief that is really but to see that we're privileged and unacceptable so close together is like, yeah.
Well, and I always think that we're superheroes. And so, are we going to use our privilege and power for good or evil? And so, if we think about those dominant groups, that left-hand column, what is the work that I need to do? And I really want us to think about, many times, what we think the work is to work with the right-handed side of the group, right? Is that, if I'm a man, I got to work with women, right? Or if I'm a cisgender person, I got to work with trans folks. No. Work with the left's work with your groups, right? I see a lot of, if I just look at race, and I do a lot of stuff around race, is, I see a lot of folks that want to escape whiteness because they don't want to be associated with other white folks, right? And because they don't want to be that white person, right? And so they will create lots of collaborative relationships with people of color, which I think is good. But they're not doing any work with their white folks. Right? I need white folks to talk about whiteness with white folks. Because I'm surviving well on my own as a person of color. Or I need to talk with my cisgendered folks, around how we show up. What's the language that we use? What are assumptions that we have? How are we challenging ourselves all the time, or how are we not? How are we letting ourselves escape from it? And so that's one of my biggest aha moments was, wow, I got to do in my dominant groups, work with other dominant folks. It's not necessarily always escaping my dominance when I work with the subordinate. Because then it makes it easier sometimes. I don't have to deal with my shit also. Some of those prejudice and biases that I hold if I work with a subordinate group. If I work with folks that are like me, it's like, oh, some of that ugly comes out in me sometimes too. That is a rough space. Any other X?
Sometimes very difficult for the dominant group to change them.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so for me, it's not even that they're so established. I'm so established because I'm part of them. Right? Like I'm part of the Catholic, right? Christian. I'm part of that. Right? And so how am I having conversations with Costco to say, why do we have to have freaking Christmas decorations in August? And so I try not to distance myself from that group because I get all the privileges that they get because I'm part of them. And so how do I see part of me in them? And that's some harsh reality. Yeah. It's rough work.
Teaching students, do you have a list on your website of you did mention one?
I do. So yeah, I do have some, and I'm in my graphic designer is redoing my website even as we speak because I was like, Alan, I need a new redesign, and I've learned a lot about websites since because he gave me the homework to do, and I was like, oh, I don't understand any of this. So there is a resource space. Let's see. There's also so my quote unquote in my Christian space, my Bibles of this work is teachings for diversity and social justice and readings for diversity and social justice. So the actual teachings book, it's called the Orange Book, and get the second edition.
Called the Orange Book.
Yeah, well, I call it the Orange Book. That's what we in social justice call it the Orange Book, but it's called Teachings for Diversity and Social Justice. And it actually has some really good information in the beginning, and then it has different, let's see, it's race, class, gender, religion and spirituality, and ability. So it has actually curriculum for those 5 identities. Yeah. So that might be good for you all as you're developing curriculum.
If you want to see them first, that one may has copies that you can check out. But I
Yeah, they're fabulous. And then there's the readings for diversity and social justice, and they just came out with the 3rd edition. I know, they came out with the 2nd edition 2 years ago, so that was really quick. And what this one is actually a great complement because it is shorter pieces around those same 5 identities. And it has stuff around context, content, and one other. There's like 3 kind of themes within each of them. Excellent books. Yeah. Some of them have some anthologies. Yeah, so those are the 2 ones if you want to start out. And then what you can also do is then look in the resource section because then they'll have a bunch of stuff. And that's kind of where I would start. Both of those come out of mostly practitioners and faculty members at UMass Amherst, which has, I would say, the best social justice education program in the country right now. Do you have something to add?
Well, I was going to say, there's a great service learning and community engagement program that they passed. It's a certificate or reminder and all around social justice.
And I think why their work tends to be so valued by so many people is that they're both theorists, so they're faculty members, and they're practitioners. So it's kind of the both and that you see from their work.
And remember, there's 3 classes that are kind of tools classes, and the one is theory-based, and then it goes to policy, and then it goes to organizing, which is great. We're kind of looking at that as a model for our office.
Yeah, there's some good stuff, and you can probably connect with LMA because they've got some good stuff too. Yeah, lots of books and good resources. So.
Yeah, and then
Our offices need to have a
yeah, I was just thinking it, why haven't we done that? No, it's meeting tomorrow. No, that's.
It just
We're
needs
not-
to have a
Oh,
meeting.
yeah, it needs to have one,
Okay,
yeah.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for being the strong 5.